A single sentence from across the Atlantic disrupted over a decade of carefully maintained trade balance. The moment the words 30% customs duty on all imports from the European Union were spoken, global markets trembled. Currency exchanges braced for impact, automotive stocks plunged, and in the European corridors of power a storm began to gather. The European Union didn't remain silent. It announced a retaliatory package worth $24.5 billion, signaling one of the sharpest trade confrontations between Washington and Brussels in modern history. The reaction from European leaders was swift and unified. Ursula von der Leyen dismissed the US move as populism driven by flawed economic logic. In Berlin, Chancellor Merz called for peace between allies, drawing historical parallels to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that once deepened a global depression. France's Macron was more blunt, stating that strategic patience was over. Italy's Meloni declared that Rome's response plan was ready and waiting, particularly if luxury Italian exports were targeted. Spain emphasized the critical role of agriculture, warning that striking its food sector would hit the nation's economic heart. Together, these voices formed a chorus of resistance that quickly echoed back across the Atlantic. The stakes are high. Last year alone, the EU exported around $580 billion worth of goods to the United States. Machinery, electronics, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and high-end consumer goods made up the bulk. A 30% tariff on these products would add nearly $175 billion in costs, a burden that economists agree will ultimately fall on American consumers. German-made cars alone are expected to cost an additional $6,000 at US dealerships, sparking backlash from middle-class buyers. Faced with this challenge, the EU is laying out a robust and multi-pronged counter-strategy. The first move is mirror tariffs, directly targeting the symbolic pride of American exports. From Kentucky bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles to Boeing aircraft and Tesla EVs, Brussels is preparing a list of items that strike politically sensitive sectors. Past experience during the steel and aluminum dispute showed that such targeted tariffs can provoke action within the US Congress. This time the draft list is even broader. 25% port fees for LNG ships, 35% tariffs on Boeing 737 deliveries, 40% border tax on soybeans, and even a $10,000 carbon surcharge on Tesla Model Y imports. Second, the EU may turn to the World Trade Organization. While the WTO's appellate body remains weakened, first-instance rulings can still be used for legal pressure. Europe could join forces with Canada, Japan, and Australia to launch a class action complaint that portrays the US as undermining multilateralism. Even if the legal process takes years, the reputational cost for Washington could be immense. The EU also has the authority to impose provisional tariffs while litigation is pending, giving it leverage in the short term. The third card on the table is digital taxation. Companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft have long benefited from minimal digital taxes in Europe. A sudden jump in the rate from 3% to 8% could yield $12 billion annually, and more importantly, draw fire from Silicon Valley's political lobbies. As these companies fund massive US election campaigns, the pressure from tech firms could add heat to the Oval Office. The fourth strategic tool is environmental policy. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, initially planned for 2026, could be brought forward to 2025 as a response. This would immediately affect US exports of steel, aluminum, and cement, products from sectors without meaningful carbon pricing. Analysts say this alone could add $4 billion annually to costs for US manufacturers, hitting production hubs in Pennsylvania and Ohio hard. In contrast, Brussels would promote this as a step toward climate leadership. The fifth and perhaps most sensitive area is defense and security. European nations, especially Germany, are major contributors to NATO and frequent buyers of US military equipment, but if relations continue to sour, Berlin might consider redirecting orders to European alternatives like the Franco-Italian SAM-PT system, or even the Israeli Iron Dome. The F-35 program could also be scaled back, with each unit costing $85 million. Canceling a single order of 10 would cost Lockheed Martin $850 million in revenue. In short, the US defense industry has a lot to lose. Industry-specific fallout is also becoming clearer. Europe's automotive sector, particularly manufacturers in Germany, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, produce over 5 million vehicles a year, with 1.3 million exported to the US. If demand drops due to price hikes, analysts forecast a decline of over 200,000 units and the loss of more than 100,000 jobs in Europe. Beyond assembly lines, Ripple effects will strike tire suppliers, leather interior specialists, and chip producers across the continent. In aviation, the EU also has firepower. Airbus delivers around 700 aircraft per year, with 20% destined for US carriers. Any EU retaliation here could severely damage Boeing, which is still recovering from past safety scandals. Meanwhile, US farmers who export $20 billion in food products to the EU annually, such as cheese, soybeans, and beef, face devastating losses. A shelf ban on these items could result in a 70% drop in exports, potentially reigniting the same farmer protests that disrupted US politics back in 2018. The energy front is equally precarious. The US is counting on replacing Russian gas in Europe with its own LNG exports. Currently, 2/3 of Europe's LNG comes from the US. But if the EU redirects imports toward Qatar or Nigeria, LNG terminals in Louisiana could sit idle. This would undermine America's energy dominance ambitions in Europe. Financial markets are already reacting. The European Central Bank is contemplating higher collateral requirements for dollar trades and might reclassify US bonds to less favorable categories, driving up borrowing costs for American firms. Simultaneously, the euro-dollar exchange rate is becoming more volatile. Investors are hedging, preparing for the long haul. In terms of broader geopolitical shifts, this tension could accelerate Europe's pivot toward China. Italy may revive its Belt and Road Initiative, Spain could deepen rail ties with Beijing, and Chinese capital might once again flood into Mediterranean ports. This would weaken the US containment strategy against China and mark a turning point in global alliances. Even outer space cooperation is now under threat. European components play a key role in NASA's space missions. If Brussels limits support for US projects like the Orion capsule, American moon missions could face delays. This isn't just technical, it's symbolic. Space exploration is about national pride, and losing European help would damage the US image worldwide. At the core of this brewing storm is a deep diplomatic dilemma. Is the European Union prepared to absorb economic pain, up to a 0.7% GDP contraction and over 1 million jobs lost, in order to deliver a strategic blow to Washington? The EU seems to believe that short-term sacrifice could lead to long-term strength. Technocrats in Brussels are betting that standing firm now will secure Europe's independence and resilience in the future. But what does the US truly want? According to insiders, the demands include cutting EU-China tech ties, increasing US defense exports to Europe, exclusive American LNG deals, and the acceptance of genetically modified agricultural imports. For Brussels, many of these demands are politically toxic. Especially in agriculture, any hint of compromise could spark massive protests, particularly in France. As financial markets become jittery, the euro has dropped while US futures slump. Central banks are adjusting, swap markets are reacting, and traders are bracing for impact. If this friction lasts more than 6 months, the consequences could reshape global trade alliances for years to come. In the end, it's more than just tariffs. It's a test of who sets the rules in a new global economy.